My dad was a chain-smoking Korean War era veteran who 2 days after my 17th birthday took me down to sign up to join the National Guard. I was proud for the next 24 years to wear the uniform of this country. Thank you to every single one of you who wore that uniform. And I have to tell you, like my dad before me and millions of others, the GI Bill gave me a shot at a college education.
That was Democratic Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate, at an August 10th, 2024 rally in Las Vegas. And here's Republican Indiana Senator Dan Quayle, Vice President George H.W. Bush's running mate, at the August 18th, 1988 Republican Convention in New Orleans.
Since 1980, I've been a United States Senator from Indiana, and very proud of it. Before that, I was a member of the United States House of Representatives, and proud of it. And as a young man, I served 6 years in the National Guard, and like millions of Americans who have served in the Guard, I served today, and I'm proud of that.
During the 2024 presidential campaign, Tim Walz has come under scrutiny for his service in the National Guard. During the 1988 presidential campaign, Dan Quayle came under scrutiny for his service in the National Guard. In this episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly, we remember how Dan Quayle responded during a running mate National Guard controversy 36 years ago.
This summer, as we have since 1984, C-SPAN is bringing you live, uninterrupted coverage of the national political conventions on TV, online, on our apps, and on radio. We're proud of this tradition of service setting us apart from other media. But with more people now canceling cable TV, C-SPAN's traditional funding is at risk. Hi, this is John, asking for your support. Thanks to an anonymous donor, every dollar you give will be matched up to $25,000. Double your donation to support C-SPAN's unfiltered political and public affairs programming. Visit cspan.org/donate today. Thanks. Your donation is now doubled at cspan.org/donate.
In May 1969, Dan Quayle enlisted in the Indiana National Guard. At the time, thousands of young men trying to escape service in Vietnam were placed on waiting lists for the National Guard. The issue that arose soon after George Bush picked him as running mate: did Dan Quayle join the National Guard to get out of going to Vietnam? The National Guard wasn't yet a topic on August 16, 1988. That's when, in New Orleans for the Republican Convention, Vice President George H.W. Bush announced his running mate.
And for the last few weeks, I've given a lot of thought to the selection of a running mate. And I've made a choice. And our party is blessed with a wealth of men and women who would be excellent. But my choice, and the one I will recommend, is an outstanding United States Senator. He is a leader in matters of national security. He is an innovator who is leading the effort to retrain our workers in this country so that they will be able to better lead the workforce of tomorrow. My choice for the vice presidency is Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana.
George Bush didn't mention the Vietnam War, but the next day, during an August 17, 1988 press conference, a reporter did.
Senator Quayle, I'm listening to the Democrats trying to knock you down very quickly, and this morning they were attacking you as someone who says he's tough on defense, but from your era, you didn't fight in the Vietnam War. I'm wondering if you think that that's a low blow from them, or if you'd like to respond to them going on the attack on you on that matter.
Yes, I do perceive that as being a cheap shot. I have a deep affection for those men and women that sacrificed their lives in Vietnam. And anybody to imply anything differently is just simply wrong.
Well, my point is, Mr. Bush was a war hero in World War II. You're tough on defense. Do you think it's going to be a handicap in the campaign that you didn't fight in Vietnam?
No, I do not.
Another question specifically about the National Guard.
Senator Quayle has been so much made of the fact you're a baby boomer. Maybe you can give us a little picture of yourself. Graduating in 1969, Vietnam era, you chose to go in the National Guard rather than to serve in Vietnam. Can you give us a little bit of what you were thinking during that time?
Well, growing up in Huntington, Indiana, the first thing you think about is education. You think about what any small-town person would think about, eventually growing up, raising a family. I was fortunate enough to be able to go on to law school, meet my wife. We have been blessed by 3 beautiful children. We're very happy and very content and looking forward to a very exciting campaign. I did not know in 1969 that I would be in this room today, I'll confess.
Why the National Guard rather than serving in the Army, the Marines, the Navy, or going to Vietnam?
My brother and I, 2 years younger, both went into the service at the same time, about the same time. He went into the Marine Corps, and I went into the National Guard. I went into the National Guard, and I served 6 years there, 1969 through 1975.
A headline in the next day's New Orleans Times-Picayune said, "Draft Dodger questions Dog Quayle." A C-SPAN caller from Manassas, Virginia, shared her thoughts about Dan Quayle and the National Guard and the Vietnam War.
I'm a moderate Republican. I'm 1 month younger than Senator Dan Quayle. He's a conservative, but first and foremost, we are Republicans. As a Republican, I was switching channels tonight, like a lot of people, and in there they were discussing his 6 years in the National Guard. As my husband put it very well tonight, he is retired from the service of 24 years. There is no shame in being 6 years in the National Guard in the 1960s. The press is really trying to make something out of this, like he was ducking the draft or whatever. And until people get the facts straight, and I'm talking about the media, they should not subjugate such matters to people who really, really care about America.
The next day, August 18th, 1988, Dan Quayle accepted his party's nomination as president. We'll play again the clip from his speech, which you heard at the beginning.
Since 1980, I've been a United States Senator from Indiana, and very proud of it. Before that, I was a member of the United States House of Representatives, and proud of it. And as a young man, I served 6 years in the National Guard, and like millions of Americans who have served in the Guard, I serve today, and I'm proud of that.
And here's what George Bush said about Dan Quayle during his nomination acceptance speech.
And we're going to win with the help of Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana, a young leader who has become a forceful voice in preparing America's workers for the labor force of the future. What a superb job he did here tonight. Born in the middle of the century, in the middle of America, and holding the promise of the future, I'm proud to have Dan Quayle at my side.
On August 24th, 1988, Dan Quayle addressed the Enlisted Association of the National Guard.
Finally, the cynics who have been talking about soft duty in the National Guard don't seem to mention the 214 members of Company D, 151st Infantry. This was a Ranger unit, part of the Indiana National Guard. Which was activated and sent to Vietnam the year before I signed up. This Indiana unit was one of the most decorated American units in the Vietnam War. Its members earned 19 Silver Stars, 175 Bronze Stars, and 110 Purple Hearts. Now, let's talk about Dan Quayle. Yes, as I look at all my choices back in 1969, as I was about to graduate from college, I determined that the best course of action for me was to serve my country in the National Guard just as you did. There were many decisions to be made in life at that age, and I was impatient to begin my professional career as well. And as I made those choices, I turned for guidance to the people I have counseled with all my life. The people who, before I married Marilyn, were my best friends, my mother and my father. When I entered the Guard, I was not seeking special treatment. I wasn't looking for favors. No rules were broken. And in the words of virtually every single person involved 2 decades ago, no efforts were made unfairly to influence the process. That is quite simply what happened. I'm not looking for any medals. I'm not asking for a pat on the back. But let me say this: I served. I served loyally, and I served to the best of my ability. Nearly 20 years ago, I had no reason to be ashamed of my service. And you know what? I'm sure as hell not ashamed of it now.
On October 5th, 1988, Dan Quayle debated Lloyd Bentsen. The Democratic senator from Texas was Michael Dukakis's pick for running mate. What was mentioned during the very first question? That's right, the Vietnam War. Here's Judy Woodruff.
Senator, you have been criticized, as we all know, for your decision to stay out of the Vietnam War, for your poor academic record. But more troubling to some are some of the comments that have been made by people in your own party. Just last week, former Secretary of State Haig said that your pick was the dumbest call George Bush could have made. Your leader in the Senate, Bob Dole, said that a better qualified person could have been chosen. Other Republicans have been far more critical in private. Why do you think that you have not made a more substantial impression on some of these people who have been able to observe you up close?
The question goes to whether I am qualified to be vice president, and in the case of a tragedy, whether I'm qualified to be president. Qualifications for the office of vice president or president are not age alone. You must look at accomplishments, and you must look at experience. I have more experience than others that have sought the office of vice president. Now let's look at qualifications, and let's look at the 3 biggest issues that are going to be confronting America in the next presidency. Those 3 issues are national security and arms control, jobs and education, and the federal budget deficit. On each one of those issues, I have more experience than does the governor of Massachusetts.
4 years later, during the 1992 presidential campaign, the media returned to the National Guard story. The reason? Democratic candidate Bill Clinton was accused of avoiding serving in the military during the Vietnam War. That Clinton controversy reignited the Quayle controversy. Here's Dan Quayle responding to a reporter September 13th, 1992.
What was your motivation, can you tell us, when you sought to get into the Indiana National Guard? Was it to avoid going to Vietnam?
When I graduated from college in 1969, we all had decisions to make about our military. And as a matter of fact, we had to make those decisions in some cases before we graduated. When President Nixon ended the graduate deferment, we had to make our choice on how we were going to fulfill our military obligation. My desire was to fulfill my military obligation. I chose to serve in the National Guard. Bill Clinton chose to figure out a way of not serving at all. It's rather interesting. When I was doing my active duty for the Army, I was in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and he was in Oxford, England. I chose to serve, and he chose not to.
During a September 15, 1992 speech to the National Guard Association, President Bush remarked on both Bill Clinton and Dan Quayle and military service.
There's been a lot of controversy swirling around about service to country, about using influence to avoid the military, and I've read a great deal of speculation saying that I was going to come out here and use this forum to attack Governor Clinton. I want to tell you, I do feel very strongly about certain aspects of the controversy swirling around Governor Clinton, but I didn't come here to attack him. I came to defend and support the National Guard and those who serve in it. 4 years ago, Dan Quayle was savagely attacked and ridiculed by the national press for going into the National Guard. His critics attacked the Guard as a haven for draft dodgers, and those critics are wrong. Dan Quayle spent 6 years in the Indiana National Guard. He wasn't sent to Vietnam. He was not sent to Vietnam, but some of his fellow guardsmen were, and 4 of them never came back. No candidate has ever been attacked more unmercifully than Vice President Quayle, but he stood his ground, and he answered every question calmly and with candor, and he told the truth, and this is service to country, and I am very proud of the Vice President, and I'm very proud of the National Guard.
Finally, in 1992, the Democratic candidate for vice president was Al Gore. During the Vietnam War, Al Gore was drafted for service in the military. In the Army, he served as a reporter with the 20th Engineering Battalion, which was based about 30 miles south of Saigon. Al Gore was in Vietnam for 6 months, but never saw combat. The vice presidential debate was held on October 13, 1992. A third person was on the stage, retired Vice Admiral James Stockdale, running mate for independent candidate Ross Perot. During the Vietnam War, Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war for over 7 years. Al Gore was the first to talk, and he opened the debate by mentioning the Vietnam War.
It's also a pleasure to be with my 2 opponents this evening. Admiral Stockdale, may I say it's a special honor to share this stage with you. Those of us who served in Vietnam looked at you as a national hero even before you were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And Mr. Vice President, Dan, if I may, it was 16 years ago that you and I went to the Congress on the very first day together. I'll make you a deal this evening. If you don't try to compare George Bush to Harry Truman, I won't compare you to Jack Kennedy.
And now a bonus clip. And actually, we're going to play 3 clips, all from Dan Quayle appearances on C-SPAN interview programs, talking about the National Guard and the Vietnam War and the media. First, September 11th, 1992, responding to a caller.
Now, as far as my service, my military service, and I think that this is certainly was an issue in the 1988 campaign. I think that the first 3 or 4 weeks after I was nominated as Vice President, I answered every conceivable question about my service in the National Guard, but you bring it up, and I think you deserve an answer again. So let me try to take you back to 1969 when I graduated from DePaul University. It was around that time, it was in my senior year, where President Nixon ended the deferment for graduate students. I had intended to go to law school, which I did later on. But when he ended that deferment, we had to make decisions on how we were going to fulfill our military obligation. ROTC for me at that time, my senior year, was out because I hadn't participated when I was in my early years in college. Therefore, I had a number of other options. I could have joined the Air Force, the Navy, for a period of 3 times, or for 3 years. I could have been enlisted as an officer in the Army. It is also a 3-year commitment. I could have been drafted, which would have been a 2-year commitment, or I could join the reserves. At that time, the Naval Reserves and the Air Force Reserves were full. The only ones that were open was the National Guard and the Army Reserves. I worked through my draft board like anyone else. I was determined to fulfill my military obligation, and I joined the National Guard. I did my 6-month active duty. I feel that joining the National Guard was the correct thing for me to do. I wanted to go on to law school, and at that time in 1969, even President Nixon didn't support the war in Vietnam. But let me just say this, and I want to be very, very clear with you. I've got the greatest respect and admiration for those that went to Vietnam, that served in Vietnam. They are all heroes. And I can't say anything other than that than to tell you how much that I and everyone in my family, and I know the President does too, of the tremendous affection and respect that we have for those that went to Vietnam, that volunteered to go to Vietnam, that were drafted, that went to Vietnam to serve their country there.
Second, from 1994, Dan Quayle on book notes, discussing his book, Standing Firm.
In the acknowledgments for your book, you thank a lot of people, but you say, I'd also like to thank the press, well, some of them, specifically Bob Woodward, Michael Barone, David Broder, Britt Hume, Ann Devroy, Dan Rather, Mark Shields, and Len Downey. All of them sat down with me as I worked on this book, offering valuable reflections upon my unique experience with the Fourth Estate. When did you do that, and how long did you spend with them?
I would guess I'd spent anywhere from an hour and a half to 2.5 hours with each person. It took place over a period of time, about 2 or 3 months. It was an opportunity for me to ask them some questions about themselves, about how they covered me, about the media. I think I quote almost every one of them in the book. Each one offered a different insight, a different viewpoint, but there was a lot of similarities. And the one striking thing that came through time and time again was, well, it was just these first impressions. Because I always asked them the question, I said, look, you know me, you've seen me as vice president, you saw me as senator. What happened? How did this train get so far off the track? And it came back to those first few days in the 1988 campaign, first impressions. It's an important lesson to learn and to appreciate the impact on how important first impressions really are. You know what it is when you meet someone, sort of size them up, and sometimes your first impressions are right, and sometimes that they're wrong. But in politics, and especially in a national campaign, first impressions are most important. And unfortunately for me, the first impressions that many had, and certainly most Americans who saw it via the media, was very negative. And I write about it in the book.
And third, in 1996, Dan Quayle talking to C-SPAN about the vetting process to become George Bush's 1988 running mate.
Believe me, they went over all my tax returns, my campaign forms, all the disclosures. We had hours and hours of interviews, probing questions, as they say, put you on the couch, take you back from the day you were born up to the time of the interview. It's very exhaustive, it's very personal. It is something that has to happen in any vice presidential selection process because they don't want to have surprises. In my case, with Bob Kimmel, we talked about the National Guard service. There was nothing wrong with it, and we were quite surprised that this became an issue at all. It was an issue for 2 or 3 weeks, and of course, now it's not an issue, and it wasn't an issue after the 2 or 3 weeks exhaustive investigation by the national media, who thought something was wrong by serving in the National Guard. It was just a ridiculous pursuit of time and effort that proved to be nothing.
Dan Quayle talked about his National Guard service during his 1988 vice presidential nomination acceptance speech. In his 2024 vice presidential nomination acceptance speech, will Tim Walz do likewise? Find out by watching and listening to the Democratic Convention, live gavel to gavel on the C-SPAN networks. That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. Thanks for listening and happy searching.